Our early Adventist pioneers had a radical new theology, but it wasn't just limited to the four walls of a church. They were at the forefront of many of the new social movements, such as the temperance movement, as well as the abolition of slavery. Slavery had been practiced in America since its earliest days and was considered normal in some parts of the country, but not for the early founders of Adventism. William Miller, Joseph Bates, and Joshua V. Himes all spoke actively and openly against this evil institution. In the mid-1800s, slavery was widely practiced in the southern states, but not up north, and many slaves attempted to and succeeded in escaping to freedom via the Underground Railroad. It was neither underground nor a railroad, but a network of homes, farms, and transportation that would get someone secretly from the south up to the northern states or to Canada. Perhaps the most famous name associated with this movement of liberation is Harriet Tubman, who helped thousands of people to escape. Also, Sojourner Truth spoke widely and passionately against slavery, and she was baptized as an Adventist by Uriah Smith. John Byington, the first General Conference president, used his farm in upstate New York as a stop on the Underground Railroad as well. Early Adventists were encouraged to help out in this, defying the law of the land. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed by Congress to strengthen the earlier but often neglected law of 1793. It required any citizen to return an escaped slave to his master with fines and punishments in case of violation. Ellen White, commenting on the relationship that Adventists should have to this law, said, "The law of our land requiring us to deliver an escaped slave to his master, we are not to obey, and we must abide the consequences of violating this law." J. N. Loughborough, J. N. Andrews, Uriah Smith, Joseph Bates, and James White all wrote and held positions against slavery. The church was advocating a revolutionary new approach and endeavoring to adhere to biblical principles over culture and the norms of society. Ellen White also advocated that those who held pro-slavery views should be disfellowshipped from church. As soon as slavery was abolished, the Adventist Church made inroads into the southern states, and Edson White's Morning Star boat pioneered the work in many new areas. Schools, churches, printing presses, sanitariums, and food companies were opened. As the work progressed, the need arose for a school to train workers, and on November the 16th, 1896, Oakwood Industrial School was opened. Oakwood would go on to be a flagship school amongst the African American community here in North America, and for over 120 years now, they have educated thousands of students, sending graduates all around the world. Some of their most famous graduates would include evangelists E. E. Cleveland and C. D. Brooks, just two of the many prolific pastors that have passed through this campus. Oakwood is also famous for its world-renowned choir, the Oakwood Aeolians. Oakwood will also play a role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, hosting Dr. Martin Luther King, who spoke here on this campus after there was nowhere else in the city that would have him. As a church, we once held positions on matters of equality and justice that was ahead of general society rather than behind it. In some ways, we have lost this radical edge, finding comfort in the accepted norms of practice Christianity rather than seeking clear biblical practice in all that we do. This radical and revolutionary edge that we once had needs to be reclaimed, and as a church, we ought to be at the forefront of social change, demonstrating the gospel in our communities as we seek to relieve the suffering of humanity. "There is something about your Adventist fires," local fire chief Weeks remarked. He had fought 2 Adventist fires with his success score being 0. He also said that the water poured on acted more like gasoline. Ellen White had warned the review that they were on dangerous ground and was not surprised when she heard of the fire on December the 30th, 1902. In 1901, she had written to the managers of the review and said, "I have been almost afraid to open the review, fearing that God has cleansed the publishing house by fire." The review had gotten itself into a situation where it's publishing more commercial work than what its original intention was. It had come a long way since the early days in Paris Hill, Maine, and the times of extreme sacrifice in Rochester, New York. It was now a huge institution, the largest printing press in the state of Michigan. On that day, though, nothing could stop the fire destroying the 40,000 square foot building, with only the West Building that housed the General Conference offices and book and bank depositories left standing. The review had on press at the time a book by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg entitled The Living Temple. This book had pantheistic strains throughout and would have caused much harm to the review if published. The book marked a significant shift in the philosophy of Dr. Kellogg, who had started out with such great promise and was one of the leading doctors in America. Dr. Kellogg had become controlling and dictatorial and was increasingly difficult for the church leadership to work with. Earlier that year, on February the 18th, the sanitarium suffered a fire. Was it an accident or something bigger than that? A warning for Dr. Kellogg to get back on track. The review had decided to relocate completely to Washington, D.C., in line with the new council that so many institutions should not operate in one area. Despite the warning not to rebuild a large institution, Dr. Kellogg not only rebuilt but doubled it in size. From 106 patients in 1866 to over 7,000 by 1906, it was a huge institution. Unfortunately, Dr. Kellogg would end up leaving the church, being disfellowshipped in 1907 during some turbulent times for our church. He refused to let go of the pantheistic ideas in the book The Living Temple, and also some of his medical practices started to become questionable. Unfortunately today, many of the health reform ideas have been taken over or have strong ties to Eastern religion and the New Age movement. We need to be careful that our health reform stays biblical and is not influenced by these philosophies. When John Harvey Kellogg broke away from the church, to some people it looked like the church would fall. A lot of properties were in his name and he had more employees than the whole General Conference. Some people said that we needed to compromise in order to keep him on board or else we wouldn't survive. But over the next few years and decades, the church would go on strong, and the sanitarium that had seemed so strong and vibrant would become a pale shadow of its former glory, struggling in the Great Depression and eventually closing down. Both institutions were huge, and this in itself tells us something. God does not respect the size of the institution. Sometimes we think because it's God's publishing house or God's sanitarium, then he has to bless it. No, he doesn't. God is not one to be manipulated. If we are persistent in doing our own thing and blindly keep asking for God's blessing, then there may come a time when he removes it from our lives. Size does not matter to God or mean that we have his blessing. Faithfulness does. To get to Iona today, we have to come to a town called Oban. It's about 3 hours north of Glasgow. which is about 7 hours north of London. From Oban, you have to take a ferry to the Isle of Mull. You drive 1 hour across the Isle of Mull, and then you have to take another ferry to get to Iona. It takes at least, minimum, 1 day, if not 2, just to arrive here. On the journey up here, my mind goes back to the missionaries who would go out from here. If it took us 2 days to get here, how long would it have taken them in the 500s and 600s and 700 AD to leave from this island and then spread out around Scotland, England, Wales, and then go across to Europe as missionaries? They spent a long time, long journeys traveling across as missionaries throughout the British Isles and throughout Europe because they believed fervently in the gospel which they had learned here in this mission training institute. God's calling us today as well to be missionaries for Him. It may even be just crossing the road and speaking to a neighbor. It may be talking to someone at university. It may be going to a faraway country. But wherever God is calling you today, may you take up that call and be a missionary for Him. When I was growing up, if you wanted to study history or do research on a particular topic, there was really only one option that we had, and that was to read a book.
And I never really used to like reading that much. So we decided to create a resource that would translate this written information into the language of today.
My name's Adam Ramden.
And my name is Clive COUTET.
And we are the co-founders of Lineage Journey.
Back in 2016, I was reading The Great Controversy, and I was really struggling to find any relevant video resources that I could use to aid me in my study. So I decided to approach Adam about the possibility of making some videos on the Reformation.
So we started filming in the end of 2016, and in 2017 we released 48 videos that covered the period of the early church all the way through to the end of the Reformation. Then in 2018 and 19 we released another 52 episodes on church history. These have now been viewed all over the world in over 100 countries, covering about 50 different languages, and we have over 3 million views online.
These videos have been used as a resource in both secular and Christian schools, as well as several church denominations across the globe, used in Bible studies, study groups, as well as played to the general congregation.
They also make a great online evangelistic tool where people are able to share them, and we've seen them go into countries where we ourselves can't go, countries that are Muslim, countries where the Christian message cannot go. One of the challenges we have though is that amongst our team of almost 10 people, we are all volunteers on this project, sacrificing our time, our effort and our energy in order to make these resources together.
Just to put things into perspective, each Lineage episode, as well as the filming, takes an additional 2 to 3 days in post-production. That is a lot of time and sacrifice that this team has made in putting 100 episodes together.
So we need to raise the funds to cover the cost of the filming, as well as the continued production costs that come after that.
So for as little as $1 a month, you can help us to expand this ministry to create new resources to reach more people across the world.
Thank you for visiting this page and taking the time to watch this video. We really appreciate that. Thank you for your support of the ministry so far, and we ask that you would prayerfully consider being a partner with us on this Patreon page. May God bless you, and we ask that you continue to keep this ministry and our future plans in prayer. Loma literally means beautiful hill, and the name of the area predates its use as a sanitarium or hospital by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Purchased in 1905 as one of 3 medical institutions along with Paradise Valley and Glendale Sanitarium, they added to the 26 sanitariums that the church already had at the time. Medical work was key in the early days of our church and was something that people sacrificed greatly for. In 1902, Ellen White predicted that properties would come on the market in Southern California far below their original cost. Paradise Valley was originally priced at $25,000, then reduced to $12,000, and finally purchased for just $4,000. Glendale Hospital was priced at $50,000, then it was reduced to $26,000, and then it came down to $12,000. Ellen White had said there would be 3 though, and so she instructed John Burden to look for another property between Riverside, San Bernardino, and Redlands. He found a 67-acre property that was on the market for $155,000. This was far too high. Later on, it was reduced to $110,000 and then $85,000, but this was still far too high. The General Conference had just put in place a no debt policy, and they could not help out. Eventually, the price came down to $40,000, a very good price as it included 31 acres of grain land, 22 of alfalfa, a vegetable garden, an apricot orchard, a barn, several cottages on the hill, 3 of which are still standing today, and $15,000 worth of equipment and supplies. They had to make an initial payment of $5,000, and then 3 monthly payments of $5,000, and then the remaining $20,000 at the end of 3 years. This wasn't going to be easy, but they were encouraged by the urging of Ellen White that this would also be an educational center in the future. On the 12th of June, 1905, Ellen White visited, and as she came to the property, she said several times that she had been here before. While she had not visited in person, she was referring to seeing the place in vision 2 years earlier in the autumn of 1903 and also in October of 1901. At a meeting of church members soon after, the conference president stood up and spoke and mentioned how Ellen White had said that this sanitarium should be the principal training center on the West Coast. Ellen White interrupted him and said this will be the principal training center on the West Coast. Each month when the $5,000 needed to be paid, it was a struggle, with church members across California making huge sacrificial offerings. One month they had no money until several hours before the deadline when a check arrived in the post. God had his hand in the process, and instead of taking 3 years to clear the outstanding amount, it was paid off in 6 months, meaning they got an additional deduction of $1,000. Over time, the institution would grow to include a hospital and a training school, which would later become a university, and in recent years, a children's hospital has also been added. One of the early names of the institution was the Loma College of Medical Evangelists, showing the link between evangelism and medicine. Many missionaries have gone out from this institution over the last 100 years to mission fields both here at home, but also many to abroad. The medical work is to act as the right arm of the gospel, supporting the gospel work of the church. God needs medical evangelists today who will use their medical skills to further the message and reach people in their time of need. Today there is a need for people like this to go all over the world, to places that might seem risky, to war-torn countries, to minister to those stricken by poverty, to the young and the old, as well as the wealthy and those who see no apparent need of God in their lives. The medical work breaks down barriers in ways that nothing else can. If you are in this profession or God is calling you to this work, then may you use your talents for Him in this way. Though Australia was not her home country, she had no plans to leave. And despite requests from Pastor O.A. Olson, the GC president at the time, she was happy to stay in Australia, writing to her son Edson that she had no wish to return to America. She enjoyed living in Sunnyside near Avondale and thought that this would be her last home. However, in March of 1900, she was overwhelmed by the conviction that she was needed back in America, and plans were made to set sail in August of that year. Upon arriving back in California, Ellen now needed to find a place to live and work. Oakland had grown and changed considerably since she last lived there. Following her son Willie's advice, she, along with her assistant Sarah McInturfer, headed to the St. Helena Sanitarium to get some rest while he continued to look. Someone at the sanitarium mentioned that there was a house for sale just under the hill. Upon inspection, it was agreed that it would meet her every need. It was well constructed and completely furnished. The house now needed a name, and due to the large elm trees out front, it was called Elmshaven. It was whilst living here in this house that she completed some of her key books, such as Ministry of Healing, Acts of the Apostles, and an updated version of The Great Controversy. As the years passed on, she traveled less and less, and the 1909 GC session in Washington, D.C. would be her last major trip. Towards the end of her life, Ellen White wrote a lot of counsel on their need to work the larger cities and strongly encouraged the church leaders to work the big cities of San Francisco, New York, Boston, and Los Angeles. She was frustrated by the lack of enthusiasm and support and the focus on obstacles. After some modest plans were laid, A.G. Daniels, the General Conference president at the time, was in California and wanted to visit with Ellen White. He came here to Elmshaven, but the messenger of the Lord refused to see him. She sent word to him that when he was ready to follow the work that needed to be done, then she would talk to him. He then wrote a humble and contrite letter to Ellen White. He then received a message in response that said, when the president of the General Conference is converted, he will know what to do with the messages that God has sent him. Soon afterwards, they released Elder Daniels for 1 year from his normal duties as General Conference president so he could pursue leadership in city evangelism. He chose New York City and finally fulfilled what God had intended for him to do in evangelistic work and helped launch a new day in Seventh-day Adventist city evangelism. A.G. Daniels had heard the counsel about working the cities, but he hadn't fully applied himself to it. Oftentimes we can be like that. We know what we ought to do, but we don't take it seriously, and we want God to give us more counsel or to affirm what we already are doing. God needs people who will follow the light that He gives, and then as they follow that, He will give them more light as He guides them along the pathway of life. Let us be faithful to God in all areas of our lives.